Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We have a terrific workshop. We're going to be talking about third-party risk today, and we have our panelists from ASMGi, Steve Roesing, and from the Third Party Risk Institute, Linda Tuck Chapman. So without further delay, Steve, take it away.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody attending today, for sharing your time with us. And thank you, Linda, for joining us again today. Really, really happy to have you here. And we have a great topic to talk about, and a true expert here as well. But we'll speak about third-party risk and how you can meet your compliance requirements and the balance of, risk and cost and resilience, which I think we're all getting quite familiar with these days. But I'm Steve Roesing, President CEO of ASMGi, and joining me today is Linda Tuck Chapman, as Paul stated. So thanks, Linda, for being with us today. Maybe Linda, you can tell us a little bit about yourself, and I'll pull up your dossier, just all kinds of really good stuff here. So.
Okay, that sounds good. So first of all, I'm really glad this is a workshop because this is just such a great topic. I don't know about you, Steve, but everywhere I turn, everybody is talking about third-party risk management. Even if they don't even know a whole lot about it, they're talking about it. So I have been focusing on this area for quite a long time. You can see from my career highlights, I've been a chief procurement officer and head of third-party risk in 3 very, very large banks. In fact, I've been 4 times, but because I went back to one after a 12-year absence, they asked me to come back and help them, get things back on track. And so I've really made a huge study of this, and I'm appreciative of the fact that I have the base of strategic sourcing and procurement with the work that I did there for years. But basically, I've been working in third-party risk since about year 2000, when Canada came up with the first regulations for financial services companies. But since then, I've really focused my attention on the whole. So, and I actually have specialized in the risk side of things. So I have a book. It's Third-Party Risk Management Driving Enterprise Value. It's published by Risk Management Association, and I freely admit. So they are a member, they're a .org, a members organization. Every financial entity in North America is a member. So I'm their subject matter expert and they are my publisher. So you and I have been laughing about this for a while, but my book was supposed to come out in its 2nd edition last September, but it should be out actually in the next week or 2. So I have a 2nd edition, and I've really, it is the why and the what. Right? So what are you supposed to do? Why is this all at the table, et cetera? So it really is an education in third-party risk management. My 2nd book, which is Third-Party Risk Management, a Practitioner's View, is coming out. It will be published by Institute for Internal Auditors probably this fall. And that is the what and the how, right? It's a little bit more tactical. And it goes through all the steps that you would typically have to put in place to have a good program. So I also have a certification program. So it is a 10-week program, or you can do it faster, self-paced, or slower if you like. And that is also certified for 66 CPE credits, which is a huge number if you need CPE credits. And it really, I've got a lot of students from around the world. So I do host through my company roundtable discussions, which are just really getting off the ground. And it's pretty interesting. So you can see that I am totally into this, Steve. There's nothing else that really, truly catches my attention the way this does, because there's so much to learn.
Yeah, well, that is awesome. And we speak often. So I know you're all in and totally into this. And I'm very excited to have you here today. So I appreciate that. And we'll talk about some of the things that you mentioned, like your book, for example, and the Third Party Risk Institute. We'll talk about a little bit later. When we have some promotions to go, but let's dig in a little bit on the topic. So here's what we're going to talk about, and I think it makes sense to define a few things. And the world has changed. I think it's important to understand that, right? And so pretty much everybody's perspective is different than it was a year ago, right? That's so we have I think a newfound appreciation for how things and events can really influence our day-to-day, right, and our behaviors and those kind of things, and certainly our businesses, right? So that, but in any event, so we're going to use some terms and terminology. I think it makes sense to just kind of level set around the definitions and those kind of things, and then we'll talk about some topics like best practices for strengthening your resilience, which is one of the terms that we're going to work on defining, why third and fourth party relationships, which ones really matter, and various different things. What is concentration risk? This is a term that is very, I'll say, prevalent in everyone's vocabulary is thinking about risk today, certainly. So we'll talk about what is that and why is it important. Everybody has to deal with regulations and laws and those types of things and various different compliance requirements. And so we're going to dig into that a little bit and address the third party aspect of this, right? Or do your third parties, are they looking out for you and have your best interests at heart? And service companies in general, how and why and how they stay on top of these things. So let's dig in. But I should reiterate a little bit about what you talked about. This is a workshop format, and so definitely encourage input from the audience, and please speak up if you have a question, raise your hand, or a comment or those kind of things.
What would also be really great is if people have come up with a best practice that they don't think is widely known, if they could please share it, because this is truly learning. I mean, I've been focused on third-party risk now for, like almost exclusively for more than 10 years. I can't even tell you how much I learn every week. Yeah,
no kidding. And especially right now, right? Nobody really knows what to do next. So yeah. It's a conversation more than anything. And that's certainly the way that we want to approach today's. So let's start with some definitions before we dig in to the topic. And I think, compliance, we all know what that is, right? We understand that very well, and you've been in the industry for quite some time. So I think that compliance, we don't have to worry too much about defining, but
what I would like to say, I would like to say one thing about it, Steve, is compliance actually is an outcome, right? So it's sort of like how I used to feel about being audited when I ran business units, right? It seemed like I used to get more audits than anybody on the planet, like when I came in, midterm, and when I was leaving. But basically, compliance is really, it shouldn't be your goal. It should be the result of good practices, right? And I think that people, especially early days, got a bit confused about why third-party risk management. And if you think about it from, the financial services regulators were way ahead on this. And why did they care? They care because they look at the financial system, right? So you look at the system that operates, but you also look at the component pieces, right? And so they set regulations down in order to help point people in the right direction to run their business as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I think about compliance, one of the things I think is most interesting, especially as it relates to third-party risk, right? So we know certain industries adhere to specific compliance requirements and those kind of things. But I think what we're seeing today is that a lot of industries really are pushing those requirements to third and fourth parties, right? So it's not just your third parties that have to meet these compliance requirements. You have to require them to assess their third parties, which are your fourth party. So it's really an nth party thing, I think, from a compliance thing, but there's a ripple effect, I think, on the compliance, and it's not just the people that serve a regulated industry, for example, that have to meet compliance requirements. Privacy affects everybody.
Everybody has compliance requirements, whether they have a compliance department or not. Of course, you have compliance requirements. Everybody lives under laws, right, which affect all of us. You think about the CCPA, the California Consumer Protection Act, or the big one that started all the furor, which was the GDPR out of the UK. Like there are so many laws that you have to comply with, employment laws, like it just goes on and on. So if you think that you don't have a big compliance requirement, then maybe you're not correct. Hey, listen, can I just talk about third parties for a second?
Sure.
Like what that means? because I find that when I talk to, especially when I'm talking to like executive committees in organizations, when they think third party, they think vendor, right? So it's like this contained thing, it's your vendor population, but that's actually just part of it, right? So I call those vendor third parties. And just to make it easy, I call everybody else a non-vendor third party.
Mm.
So think about all those relationships that you have in, that supports your company. Sometimes you pay the bill, right? So it's a vendor, but other times it is a strategic relationship, such as ours, right? So basically there's not money changing hands here, but it's a strategic relationship because I learn a lot from you and I learn about a lot about practices, but every company has relationships where they're not writing a check. It could be an agency relationship or a reseller. It could be a joint venture. It could be a distribution or a channel partner. It could be, bring in to help you make strategic decisions, and you don't pay them, but you might give them an equity stake. I mean, small companies do that. So this is really the whole universe. But I find if you're early days, it's easier to describe third parties and say, listen, let's just tackle the vendors right now because that's easier to wrap your head around. But in the long run, we need to look at the whole population, which is people are calling the extended enterprise, which I like that term. Yeah.
Well, and I think, with our focus being on the technology and primarily the operational side, right? The cyber risk and those kind of things, really in the world that we live in day to day, it's about the data, right? So if somebody has access to something, right, whether it's viewing the documents in your office or access to your servers or your data or your customer lists or those kind of things. And so when you think about it that way, there are probably more relationships than just vendors, right? That have those.
Absolutely. Yeah. And basically, I mean, think about if you are, you have a lot of trade secrets or you have like a highly secure environment. I mean, you might even want to be protecting the building plans, right? So it is, it's a really broad universe. And I just wanted to bring that up because some people think
I appreciate that. And it's true. And it's something that we'll probably touch on that a little bit later as it relates to, identifying who your third parties are and those kind of things. Cost, I think we all understand what cost is, right? That's so not a lot of effort that we'll put into really defining that. And in general, I think that the fundamental understanding is that as compliance goes up or your requirements compliance go up, or if you mitigate more risk, there's usually some cost involved, right? So you make an investment and you mitigate a risk. So that's the trade-off, I think, from cost. Risk and resilience, I think that we should spend a little bit of time defining those, and maybe we'll start with risk.
Yeah, I want to talk about cost for one more minute, if that's okay.
Please.
Because people recognize the cost of, putting a system in place or the cost to remediate an event. But I ran across a statistic. EY wrote a really good paper about the cost of risk management and compliance in highly regulated entities, and it was actually a fairly shocking number. So approximately 10 to 15% of internal resource capacity in highly regulated entities is dedicated to risk and compliance activities. Now, isn't that a lot? Imagine if you had an extra 10 to 15% of people in your organization, or even an extra 5%. If you can actually embark on third-party risk management sensibly, use technology wisely, use data analytics wisely, I mean, wouldn't that be good? Because that's a hidden cost, but it's a super real cost too.
Right. It is super real, and it's often left out of evaluations. I should say, like total cost of ownership models. A lot of times people don't consider what we talk about a lot are the operating costs, which the people fall under, and those kind of things. Getting it done every day. So I think that the point that you make is certainly valid. It's very expensive to do all these things, right? There's cost associated with that. And
I'm also going to ask if there's anybody out there who's ever done a cost study on third-party risk management. I would be interested. I actually, when I wrote the book, I did some cost estimates I talked to a few executives, but they're a pretty broad range. So if anybody has a really good cost equation for third-party risk management and the compliance, risk management and compliance activities, that'd be really great to see.
Awesome. Yeah, great. And I'll just remind everybody, raise your hand and we'll make sure, I think that we have to do this through the central management console. So Paul will unmute you and feel free to speak up at any time with these things, but definitely interested in what other people are doing in this space. So let's talk about risk a little bit, Linda. Why don't you go ahead and explain, if you could, just explain a little bit about this equation and what it means to you.
Sure. Now, anybody who's been in operational risk will say, hey, this is not the right equation. But I would put a counter argument. So the normal operational risk formula is exposure times likelihood, right? So exposure, the amount exposed to, the likelihood of a risk event equation. Well, that you had decades of data to rely on to understand the likelihood. So because I come out of financial services, I can tell you that on the credit side, they have 100 years worth of data to determine the risk of default, right? That's a likelihood of, on a loan. Have at the very most probably data on third-party risk management, if that, and it's not even very good data because new data. So this is the applies, and quite truthfully, other and I've actually also been able to communicate this quite successfully to chief risk officers. So the risk is actually the exposure. So how much exposure do you to risk because of your relationship with this with this or any third party, right? So that would be a factor of, oh, and I see my audio is choppy. I'm so sorry. I'm in a big city and we have terrible internet here. So my apologies. But so basically exposure is what types of risk, which is the type, the quantity of risk that you're exposed to. So how much risk is there? So is it 10 records or 1,000? And how important is this relationship or this activity to the overall success of your company? Because they're not all one size fits all. So a good measure would be impact on revenue, impact on reputation, impact on core services. So that's kind of the exposure component. And then the controls part of it is the third party's controls, right? They're preventive, detective, and response controls, and yours, right? You're going to have to actually put some on top. But for now, we're really focusing on the third party control environment. And that's where a lot of people don't understand third party risk management, right? So what you're really looking at is, in fact, you're looking at the control environment that you're, because the way that they run their business can affect the way that it can affect your risk, right? So if they have good controls, then in the old equation, it reduces the likelihood. But if they have weak controls, you got yourself a problem and your risk goes up, right? So it's this combination of factors, and that's why the other equation doesn't work, right? Because we don't know what the likelihood is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, so you'll probably have some comments here, but I'll pull up some additional information. But from the cyber world, we're used to risk, the equation risk equals likelihood times impact, and if you think about it in those terms, you identify the likelihood of an event happening. And you don't always know, quite honestly. We're going to talk about some of those things, some of those unknowns. But there are different ways, and I should say that they're maybe not so scientific, right?
They're not.
Right. There's a lot of debate about this right now and how to quantify risk, right? So I think risk we're used to seeing in a quantified measure, like we're seeing a number about it, right? But if you evaluate a risk rating system, for example, like vulnerabilities in IT related vulnerabilities and those kind of things, there's a number associated with that, but it's not a dollar impact. It's a it's a risk rating. And so, and generally it involves the likelihood of, you know, that exposure, of that vulnerability being exploited, those kind of
Well,
things.
I hope you don't mind if I tease you, but you know, it's hard to be married to likelihood when we really don't know, right?
Yeah, I agree.
But,
I agree. And we're going to talk about a lot of unknowns today, to
yeah.
be honest, right? So that's,
Okay.
that's great. That's great. So I have another thought about risk being generally known events, right? Things that you know about. So you go through a discovery process, you identify risks, you put them in a risk register and those kind of things. And then somehow you quantify them, right? Which is magic in a lot of cases, right? It's a made up number, I think, but it's quantifiable somehow, right? So
It is. It absolutely is. So this is where I totally agree with you. If you have a good view on the control environment that you expect, right? And how important those controls are to protecting your organization. So for example, having a policy is not the same thing as having good access control so that when somebody leaves the organization that you can remove them from the system in a short period of time. Right. Those are so the actual controls themselves could have a different impact if they're there or not. And that's how you start to move away from basically sort of this airy-fairy discussion into something that is quantifiable. So when I work with organizations to help them design their risk assessments and their controls assessments, you're structure around it, right? And you're trying to understand how important is this control to the overall control environment. And you can start to put formulas in. Like I'm a big fan of, if you don't have a technology, well, you know what? Some of the simple technologies like Excel and Google Sheets have really good functionality. You can actually build equations in them and if then scenarios. So you can come up with a quantifiable assessment. But the other thing that I feel very strongly about is you shouldn't leave it there. You should really, that's what risk experts are for, right? So take the heavy lifting, you know, to get to a reasonable view of the world off their shoulders by automating. And then the second thing is apply expert judgment,
right.
because the qualitative side of things, it shouldn't come first, it should come second.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. And I did want to point out that in general, the risk equation it's pretty simple math, right? It's pretty straightforward. It's a multiplier, right? So again, I think in my thinking is generally along the lines of likelihood times impact, right? And because that's what I've been trained to think like. But if you reduce either one of those, theoretically, you're reducing the risk, right? Or certainly if you reduce both of those, or if one of those goes to zero, then the risk is zero, right? And so it's important to understand those types of things. And I think the math doesn't change. If you change the variables a little bit, then you just have to change the way you think about it and the way you explain it. But the math is still pretty straightforward, right?
And this is how you start to have a same view of risk across a large population of relationships, is to actually have structure, to have a scoring methodology, and then basically to play it out, because you can turn numbers into words, right? So you think about risk thresholds. So if it comes out, let's say, even up to 1,000, they don't really. Everything's out of 100. It's a percentage of 100. So you can put as many numbers in there. Just don't chop them up too small, right?
Yeah.
So, people give 2% to this and 1% to that. That is actually a losing proposition because it kind of masks the importance. So what you really want to do is you want to look for the controls, but you want to really rate the heavy hitters, the ones that have the most impact on you. And then the other information can allow you to calibrate, is it actually a higher risk because might be okay, but all the supporting controls that go with that are not as robust as you would like.
Yep.
So it's really how you think about quantifying your risk. So as I say, basically have a good structure, being able to score it, being able to say, listen, anything with a score over X is high risk, under X is low risk.
Yep.
And what allows you to do is you can move your scales over time based on the changing environment, as opposed to changing your process.
Right.
That's what we're trying to do, is come up with something that's going to last for a while.
Yep. Understood. And I think I'll reach out to the audience at this point and just ask if does anybody have anything to share about how the treatment of risk and how you identify and quantify and or risk rate, your risks when you put them in a risk register? How do you come up with an impact for that? Does anybody care to chime in on that? Give a second.
And I'm happy for you to tell me that I'm wrong on the exposure times likelihood equals impact, or, but basically I haven't been able to come up with something reasonable that says you could use the likelihood factor. But if there's somebody out there who has crossed that bridge and come out to the other side and things are looking good, can you share it? And I just want to remind people, this is a workshop, right? We're supposed to be talking to each other, not just me and Steve.
We could do this all day and have, I'm going to go ahead and toggle to the treatment of risk. And this came right directly from your material, Linda. So just maybe you can chime in a little bit on this and the 4 treatments of risk.
Yeah, and this is just a simple set of statements, right? So number 1 is actually on the far side. So number 1 actually should be thinking, or number 2 is really what you should think about. You and I were talking about this yesterday, right? If you don't take the risk on in the first place, if you avoid it, good for you, right? Because there are certain types of risks that you can avoid. And a lot of that, because of my years as a chief procurement officer looking at deal structuring, I mean, there's no 2 contracts that are the same by and large for complex services in particular. Right. So there are different ways to structure your contract or your engagement, or how they access your systems or whatnot. I mean, on premises, different risk profile than in the cloud, for example. Right. So you want to think about basically, could you avoid the risk in the first place? And if that's the possibility, and you can still do business with them, good for you for thinking it through, right? Because people are so busy trying to get things done that sometimes they forget about the obvious, which is let's try and avoid it, right? So, and then there are ways that you could perhaps transfer risk. You never completely transfer risk, of course, because you always hold the ultimate accountability, but you can actually kind of share the risk. So for example, I mean, easy example, they're buying insurance, right? Because thank God you hardly ever have to use it. But when you do, what you've done actually is to transfer some of the risk of that transaction to your insurance company. So can you comment a little bit on cyber risk, just while we take a little bit of a side trip here? Because
and I was going to jump and chime in because I'm starting to hear this a lot. And I actually sat on a panel with some cyber insurance folks, and they're denying policies today. So it's becoming harder and harder to play that card, right? But there are people that I talk to in various different industries that say, I'm not worried, I have insurance, right? That's and I just think that's a flawed way to approach the problem.
Well, yeah, I mean, if your house burns down, you have insurance. Like, is that really good enough?
I mean, you're still standing on the lawn watching it burn down, right? And
with all your precious stuff inside.
That's right. That's exactly correct. And that's a great metaphor, and I love that as well. But so cyber risk, as you can imagine, with many risks, they're on the rise, right? It's an increasing thing, and it's very costly to a lot of organizations. But ransomware is, every 11 seconds in 2021, it's just a phenomenal amount of activity or episodes or events, if you will, or incidents, those kind of things. So, but the cost to businesses is phenomenal. And so the conversation that we're having isn't just about doing things yourself to mitigate these risks and offset these risks and certainly avoid them if possible, right? But it's about what are your third parties doing to protect you as well. And we're going to get to some of that. But from a cyber risk standpoint, certainly it's on the rise. And it's top of mind for a lot of different people, not just people who are in the industry, but certainly people who have had an event or an incident and had to pay money out of their pocket or been down for a certain amount of time or those types of things. So certainly it's a consideration from that perspective.
Yeah. And then anyhow, and then of course there's reducing the risk, right? There's many ways to reduce the risk. If you choose the right third party, I mean, honestly, it reminds me of taking my MBA, right? You finish at the end and you think, well, what did I learn? I learned, it depends, right? That's what you actually learn when you go to school for all those.
That's right.
And spend all that money. Well, when I wrote the book, it sounds really obvious, but the truth of the matter is I ended by thinking, gosh, you just have to get into business with the right third party in the first place. And everything else, basically, you can probably deal with, because every relationship is going to bring a certain amount of risk. And choosing the right third parties to work with is really something that people might rush into. But in the long run, you're going to have problems, right? It just is the way of life. And when I was a judge on the Outsourcing Excellence Awards panel for about 5 years, and some of the very best relationships out there sure had a rocky beginning, but it was really getting in business with the right third party. And that means that also third parties are really looking very carefully at their clients, because their clients can form reputational risk for them, or they can be just too hard to work with, right? So everybody always thought that, gosh, you're writing the check, you have the, it's sort of the buyer's advantage. But the truth is that most companies now they're quite careful who they get into business with as well, and the nature of the relationship and the structure and what they're willing to give in the contract, because they need to be assured that you're going to protect their reputation too.
Yep. Yep. And I think one of the things that we see a lot in business, it's difficult to imagine any business not leveraging a third party for something, right? It's
not possible. Like, unless you're even
more challenging. That's right. That's right. I don't think you've ever been able to do everything, but be everything to all people. But today, what we see a lot of market pressure on, staff reduction and those kind of things, and it's just so hard to do all of the things that are required to keep up. I wanted to pull up, Linda, a metaphor that you used. Again, I pulled this right from your material. So, but this is exactly what you were speaking about, and it's very much like the last slide. But I love this metaphor because it really, you talked about avoid risk being the first option. Just walk away from the cliff. That's kind of the metaphor that you use, and I think that's a great message for people. Like, if you have the opportunity to avoid the risk, just do that, right? There doesn't have to be a cliff there, or maybe there does. If there does have to be a cliff, then you have to choose one of the other treatment methods. But the first option should always be, is it possible to just walk away and not, not have a cliff there? It's a great option. So.
Well, and I like the little bouncy trampoline in the second one, the mitigation. But the truth of the matter is that you really need to be quite prudent in these relationships. So let me, first of all, I just want to go back to sort of the larger picture. As I had someone, I did a steering committee yesterday, and I was on a steering committee, and the senior executive was really curious about, well, we have thousands of third-party relationships. And so, like, do we have to do this for everything? And the truth is no. At the end of the day, that's why having a really good view of the world in terms of, what are you getting into? What's your risk exposure, right? So having some pretty intentional view of the risks, so they're there. And then what is the control environment? That you got to do that for a certain amount of your population, but there are many, many transactional relationships that you just need a very light touch. Have a contract, get some insurance, see you later. So it's really what we're talking about when it comes and the heavy lifting. It's a small population of your contract. So I really know the financial services sector best. And that, I worked in organizations where we could have like maybe 50,000 vendors alone. And so my experience tells me that between 10 and 13% of your total population of vendors will probably need risk treatment. There's no hard and fast number for your non-vendors, because every business is so different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've had customers ask me this question quite often. What happens if my vendor, has risks, right? If we put a third-party risk program in place, it's almost like not knowing is better than knowing, right? And I just don't think that's true anymore, right? If you know about it, like, our job is to give you the information you need to make a good business decision. If that information is there are risks in place, you should know about them, right?
Well,
I would want to know about them, but and anyway, any comments on that? Or
Yeah, I remember when I was actually working in a large institution, and we put in a new third-party risk management program, like something pretty robust. And the day before the reporting was going to be produced for the organization, I remember having a meeting with my boss, and he said, "Well, because I said, well, you'll get your reporting." He really ran a great deal of the company, right? So you get your reporting tomorrow. He says, "Well, what if I don't like what I see? What if like," and I said, "Well, I guess the question I have to ask you is like, are you sure you don't want to know?"
I think that that's an important message for companies today. The ignorance is bliss card is not valid anymore. If you experience a data breach or, some event, right, some bad activity or some
Yeah.
exposure of risk, um, the market doesn't really care.
That is true. So you have a good program, but you know what? It's back to risk acceptance, right? In the previous world that we lived in many, many, many companies, the business was running the business. They own the P&L, they own the risk, which of course they do. But the question that is being asked now, or what I would ask is, should a business leader be able to accept any form of risk on behalf of the organization?
Right.
Right. And I think the answer to that is, not anymore. But that is certainly, that is something that I ran into over and over and over again.
Yep.
Right. So the business is just going to accept the risk. So, have at it. Well, what would be the point? What would be the point of having a program? Right. Because if they can just accept the risk and then they just drive on, I don't really get the point of investing in anything.
Right. Right. I think, to that end, it should provoke a conversation, right? That's
Yeah.
not a decision being made, but a conversation.
Yeah.
Nobody should make decisions like that. Nobody should accept risk in a vacuum, right? That's
Well,
for your organization.
and it's really trying to define what is excessive risk, because of course they're going to accept risk, right? There's no such thing as a relation. And so the real question is then, how much risk should they be able to accept? I'm very fond of a tool that companies should put in place called effective challenge, right? So a challenge process is a way that your workers can have air cover when they see something that doesn't look right, right? So it's sort of like that, New York subway thing. If you see something, say something. Well, unless you have some sort of, challenge process that's accepted and there's a place for these concerns to go, then basically people who are doing the work in here, they're not usually feeling terribly comfortable about telling a senior person, gosh, this looks too risky for the company to take on. So they often, they'll pass it along, but they don't feel comfortable really saying anything. So the idea in effective challenge is that, everybody has a responsibility for risk management. And if you see something that falls outside of the norm, the best way to handle it is, you're not the only risk specialist in the world. Get together with a group of risk specialists in your organization, have a discussion about it to find out, do you think that I'm correct that this is excessive risk? And if the answer is yes, then basically you should be able to take it to your risk oversight group and say, could you have a look at this? This is of a concern. And if you don't have that process established, it would be a really good idea to put it in place. Well, I think we have a couple of questions or comments. But
Yeah.
anyhow, that challenge, it's a tool that I think they can't do their job, right?
Yep. And I
Okay, so I see a couple of comments and questions.
Yep.
So yeah, do you want to take those?
If you could, that would be great. For whatever reason, my
Your
display,
chat's not working?
lost
Okay.
my display, so I'm writing a little bit behind. And
You would okay. So the first one says, our organization leaders to risk acknowledgements. Only our board can accept the risk, and the process includes senior management keeping the board informed about certain risks that they've acknowledged. And it's kind of interesting that you would say that, because the only people in the organization who are personally liable are people on the board of directors, right? Everybody else, it's a job. And I guess if they do something illegal, then they personally could suffer for it. But generally speaking, the operation of the company, even though it's in the hands of senior management, the personal liability only rests with the board. So it may be that, I don't know if I won't say your last name unless you want me to, but Rosalie, it may be that the structure of your organization is that that the board is very close to this and have a personal stake and have chosen to be the only ones that accept the risk in your company. I don't know enough about it to know, but in larger organizations, the board absolutely must be informed about the risks and how you got there and this type of things. And quite often they want to be involved in approving some of these complex relationships. But as far as risk acceptance goes, that would be very specific, I think, to the company as opposed to a general practice.
Yep. Just one comment, Linda. Certainly that applies if a company is large and public, right? But if they're smaller and private, maybe it doesn't apply, right? But maybe there are designated people who have a stake, right? And need to approve those risks. So that is certainly a possibility.
And good for their board for being so engaged, because a lot of times people on boards, they don't know enough about it actually. So so good on that. Now, Rosalie also said that the formal process is intended to make these acknowledgements visible so we can remain aware of the level of risk in one or more areas they're taking on. So I think that this can be accomplished absolutely by having your board approve it. But as you said, Stephen, larger organizations, that might not be practical or probably wouldn't be. So there's honestly, in one of the companies I worked for, I had 14 risk oversight committees I reported to. 14. Anyhow, so that's a little bit too much the other way. So what I would suggest is basically, maybe if we could have a little side trip into board reporting. So generally speaking, your board should be the ones approving policies, including your third party and your cyber, et cetera. They should be aware of your due diligence, how you go about risk assessing, like recognizing risks and doing the due diligence on the third parties. And they should actually be, so they should be aware of that. And then for regular board risk reporting, the kinds of things that they need to know is if you've got a good tiering system, then you would separate the notion of criticality from exposure to risk, so you don't kind of blur muddy the waters. They always want to know about your top tier relationships, right? How are they performing? How much money you're spending on it, and that type of thing. Have there been any risk events? And then selectively, you might give them a view of the portfolio, particularly if there's higher risk or there's something unusual going on. And sometimes they want to see separate categories for material outsourcing arrangements. And if you haven't done this, I suggest you do, give them an update on your innovation. Right? It's a good way to profile all the good work your company is doing on innovation. You can slip it in under the risk lens, right? So that's just a bit of a side trip.
Mm-hmm. And I think, Linda, it's worth noting that it is a good thing, and you mentioned this. It's great that the board is asking questions and wants to be involved that way, and that I get concerned when that doesn't happen, right?
And when they don't understand, right? So.
And when they don't understand, so that's exactly where I was going to go with that. Yep.
So board terms are being limited now. It used to be kind of like job for life. And also in the world of board governance, they're doing a much better job in selecting for different skill sets that complement the business and what they need to know. Now, there's one other question that maybe you could start with the answer, which is from Liz. Would love your perspective on how to accurately monitor risk in real time. So do you want to take a first crack at that?
Yeah, and I think a lot of it depends on what type of risk we're talking about. But what we see a lot of on the cyber side, from even measuring risk for third parties, for example, are just the outside in view of risk, which is a scan of all, it's basically what the bad guys see, right? It's external. Yeah. Products like BitSight or Security Scorecard or those kind of things, and some other products have external monitoring capabilities, but they do a constant evaluation of risk. And it's just one source of data, but it's a good perspective to gain that treatment of risk and just understand where your third parties really fall in their abilities to do those kind of things, right? If you're finding all these vulnerabilities, then it's a good time to have a conversation with that third party, right? And say, hey, what's going on? How come we see all these things? And so what that drives is the conversation. And then it's even possible to set some limits and some boundaries and those kind of things and say, hey, if you want to continue doing business with us, you have to meet this baseline of controls and those kind of things. So, But that's what we see from a monitoring standpoint. But there are other tools depending on what type of risk it is. Anything to add to that, Linda, or should I?
Yeah, so number one, cybersecurity monitoring, as you mentioned. So there's some really good companies out there. They can tell you when there's been attacks on your third parties, right? So you can set them up with your third party list. So the attacks, basically security posture, if they've had any breaches, et cetera, and you can set monitors and alerts on that. So that's a really good service and they're widely used. Financial health is one you also need to be concerned with. There's two different sort of views. So there's a payment history view, which companies like Dun & Bradstreet have tools, then they can give you alerts when the rating has changed. S&P looks at the large companies, et cetera, so you can get alerts that there's been downgrades. And then there's companies like Rapid Ratings, and they do financial statement analysis, and they'll also tackle private companies, right? So, but you still have to get the financial statements from them, and I have ideas about how to do that. But in the long run, those are the most common ones out there because you're looking for evidence of weaknesses or breach on things that are really matter. A downgrade or in particular, or something that's happening with your financial health, because poor financial health says you're going to have problems too. And then there's also this whole negative news monitoring, in my opinion, is a black hole, right? Because you can subscribe to Google Alerts or whatever, or a service. And I would love to see them tone it down, because right now you get like TMI, you get so much information that it's just noise. So finding a way to settle that down so that there would be better screening and filtering is that if you're out there and you're an entrepreneur, if you can solve that one, you're going to have 1 million clients right off the bat. So those are the biggies for monitoring. And then of course you're reliant on the business. They're looking at performance scorecards, health checks into them, et cetera. But there is no such thing as sort of like total relationship continuous monitoring in one tool today that I'm aware of.
There are certainly a lot of aspects.
Yeah. Okay.
This came from your material as well.
So this is actually also from something that I posted, and
you're breaking up a little bit, Linda.
I know, I'm sorry. Yeah. So this is I can hear you. Internet's really choppy right now. Sorry, can you speak to this, Steve? I'm noticing my internet going in and out. I'm really sorry.
Yeah.
What can I say?
Yeah, well, that's so information risk, and again, this came directly from your material, but I thought it was relevant because especially from talking about risk and those kind of things, and this is really an example of how you would evaluate information risk, and start with a questionnaire. I think one of the comments that's worth noting is that as a company, we're responsible for evaluating third-party risk, but we're probably also being evaluated by our customers, right? So it's kind of like a little bit of a double whammy, but there's a questionnaire involved usually to start with the information risk process, and then there has to be some assessment against that and evaluation of that and documentation and those kind of things. But look at all of the controls in place and those kind of things, and then figure out how you're going to respond. And I think this speaks, Linda, to the things that we talked about a little bit earlier, like just knowing that most vendors are going to have some kind of risk, right? So it's really about starting a dialogue about what to do and responding to those versus reacting. And I think that's a valid point to make.
I'd like to make a recommendation on future state, right? Because I work with organizations that are trying to strengthen their program and streamline it. So if you're maybe at an earlier stage, the question I would ask myself basically is, when I'm structuring my own due diligence request, can I break it up in such a way that I'm not asking everybody everything, right? And it's the same thing with incoming due diligence. So I don't know how many you respond to, but so a few weeks ago, I was working with the head of business continuity management about third-party risk, right? So first of all, she really wanted to chuck me off soon because she was so sick and tired of responding to incoming. But interestingly enough, then when I got what she wanted to ask on the outgoing, it was a really long list. So I think there's got to be some balance here. So I think that if you can do a good job, especially if you're systematized, right? If you spend money on technology, you can find a way to link the risk exposure with the types of questions and controls that you're trying to examine. Because sending out a one size fits all is going to be too much or too little for just about everybody. So I think even if you're doing it manually, if you can break up the component pieces pretty carefully so that when you're sending it out, you only send out what you need. And when you are being asked, you only send them what they need as opposed to an everything, and have a precast set of responses.
Yep.
Because in the long run, I mean, people are just getting crushed by the workload for the same stuff over and over again with slightly different wording.
Right. And a lot of the questionnaires we have now have contingencies built into them. For example, like if something's true, then you get 7 additional questions, right? If it's not true, then that part collapses, right? So if you have access to data, for example, then you have to have these controls in place. If you don't have access to data, you don't, and those kind of things.
Yeah. And
I think that matters. Yeah.
But it's a big reveal, right? When you find out, when you said yes, you got 50 new questions. Darn.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Yep. So let's keep moving and get into defining resilience a little bit, because I think this is kind of, the basis for the conversation today. And I just thought, okay, this is a tough concept, and it isn't a tough concept, right? So it could be a very simple definition. And I thought about starting with Merriam-Webster, right? So the Merriam-Webster definition is an ability to recover or adjust from any kind of misfortune or change. So I thought that was good. And I'll just go ahead and pull up a different perspective, or a deeper dive type definition, which is the capacity of a dynamic system to adapt successfully to challenges that threaten the function, survival, or future development of the system. And so it's a little bit, you can see that it's a complex concept, right? It starts to get, and even the concept of a dynamic system, right? We can start to see some of the complexities unveil, but I'm just wondering, Linda, if you can reflect on this a little bit.
It's interesting because when I first got into being a subject matter expert, I was being directed by some people who had been in it much longer than myself, that the purpose of third-party risk management, or any form of operational risk management, was in fact to minimize the financial cost of a risk event, right? That actually was sort of to put a dollar value on a risk event, and whether or not you successfully reduce that event, that exposure, or eliminated it or avoided it. But I don't think that's what this is all about. I mean, I hadn't really thought of, even at the time, it didn't sound right to me, but for sure, today's environment is all about business, right? Because, the word is simple, but it's very, very difficult to have true resilience. So my thinking is basically that rather than focused on the activities of third-party risk management, think about why you're doing it, right? And what can you do to help your company and your business do everything that they said they would, right? Deliver to customers, make sure that your revenue is protected, make sure that you comply with regulations and laws, and protect your reputation. Because in the long run, that's why you're in business. So if you get lost in the task management side of things, and you get married to your own ideas about how to tackle this, I think you're missing the point. The point is to make your company resilient, right? So it can bounce back, and hopefully it doesn't have to, and basically to make it to help it thrive in the future. That's what your job is if you're in this area.
Yep. And I think it's really about, to your point, no matter what happens, you need to be able to continue to operate and not just survive, but thrive, right? I wanted to point out that in general, resiliency is tagged to unknown type activities, right? Whereas risk was known activities, right? And so you put them in a risk register and those types of things. In general, things that comprise events or incidents that drive resiliency are generally unknown. And in general, again, and the reason I say this out loud often is because, you know, we've done a lot of work in the disaster recovery and the business continuity space, right? And not all, when you talk about resiliency and business continuity, it's not all unknowns. There's no question. But when you compare resiliency to risk, I think a lot of times resiliency are more low probability, high impact events like COVID-19 or global pandemics, you know, whether it's bird flu or whatever it is, right? That's, you know, these types of activities, we generally think about, how am I going to do business if something like this happens, right? Something that's, it's not real probable, there's a low probability, but a very, very high impact and a global reach and those kind of things.
Well, my practice on third-party risk was really focused for many years on separating the concepts of criticality, right? So how much reliance do you have on this relationship or this activity, and the exposure to risk, right? It was kind of a two-dimensional view of the world. And I was kind of leaning into this before the pandemic, but I'm firmly there now. There needs to be a third dimension, and it would be the third party and fourth party relationships that help you deliver against a dollar of revenue. Mm-hmm. And when you're thinking about the importance of relationship, we have been blinded by this tiering, right? Because what we found out in the pandemic is it's not the big guys that are having problems, right? It's the smaller ones, the third and the fourth smaller relationships that you have are in. So the truth of the matter is that you really need to think about your revenue streams and your core services, and every component piece, whether it's inside your company and outside your company, how are you delivering those goods or services? And that's how you start to really think differently about third-party risk management, because now you can start to put some real business perspective on it. What do you think of that?
No, I think it's a great point. And I think a lot about disaster recovery. When I used to talk to people about disaster recovery, they'd say, yeah, we back our data up. And, you know, my response to that was always or disaster recovery is not about backing your data up. It's about recovering if you have an incident, right? Yep. Which is resilience, quite honestly, right? That's so it's not like it's a new concept. I think it's been around in certain areas of the business, and we're starting to see it really, but people are scratching their heads and they're saying, how do we continue operations and how do we thrive when the rest of the world seems to, you know, be in a crisis or what have you. And I think those are the kind of things that need to be addressed and that need to be talked about at organizations. This graphic just kind of takes that concept about risk versus resilience and visualizes it a little bit more, right? And risk in the context of risk versus resilience, a lot of times are the things that are above the water line on the iceberg scenario, right? That's they're known and they're quantifiable threats and those types of things. And I think that's consistent from the approach that organizations take to addressing risks, right? Putting them in a risk register and quantifying them and doing all those things. And resilience tend to be the things that are below the water line from a visual standpoint, right? They're unknowns and they have a larger impact and a lower probability and all those things. So any comments on that, Linda?
Yeah. You know, from a business lens, sometimes the business feels really overwhelmed with all the risk talk, right? Of, you know, risk registers and hundreds of risks and all this process. And, you know, if we're doing our job, we really simplify it in the back end. So what comes to the business is consumable, right? That they really understand not just the risks they're up against and, you know, whether or not those are risks that are in their immediate future or not, but also what to do, right? So I saw that early days pandemic, some heads of third-party risk, where they would do all this analysis and fire it off to senior management. And senior management would say, that's nice. Now what are we supposed to do with this? Right. So that actually is, it's a thinking element of this. I did a poll actually a couple of weeks ago on LinkedIn, and I was really looking at sort of the, you know, where do you think you really need to spend your energy, or where are things going? And 48% of people responded. They said that really where the future is headed is data-driven risk analysis, right? So that implies that you are starting to treat your data around risk and relationships like any other big data factory, right? So you've got a data warehouse, and doing a much better job at analyzing that data and deciding where to spend your energy or what is of concern is not really happening today, right? We've been so focused on, due diligence and gathering data, et cetera, that we forgot that the real job is to analyze it and figure out what to do with it.
That's right. I'm going to keep on moving. So when we talk about risk resilience integration, again, this comes from the same place that other visual does. I thought this was interesting because there are three different, I'll say, perspectives and ways to look at resilience. One is, it is the goal of risk management, right? And I think you make the statement, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but the goal of third-party risk management, right, is really business resilience. And I think that's consistent with what you shared a little bit ago. But the other perspective is that it's part of it, right? It's a subset of risk management. And then the third perspective being an alternative to risk management, right? So any thoughts on alignment there?
Yeah, I like this comment in the third bullet talking about nonlinear dynamic risks, right? So they're very complex. And I really do think that there is people who are in risk, audit, or compliance functions have a real opportunity to shine here. You think about basically sort of the rise of the CIO. The truth of the matter is that there's so much good you can do by sitting back and thinking things through and actually understanding the environment and helping your organization prevent or avoid a risk event. So it's interesting, actually, one of my close friends who is a CPO, actually, he told me back in February of 2020 that he put a bunch of contracts in place to allow for work from home with their offshore resources. And you know how he knew that? It's because he's a good thinker. He was talking to people that he'd worked with in Asia. He worked internationally, and he was starting to hear about all kinds of issues coming out of China and through Asia with the pandemic. So before anybody really was on their radar, I wish I'd talked more to him. He started putting contracts in place to allow for work from home and deploying laptops in February. Interesting, huh? That's a thinker. That is a real.
It's very interesting, since one of the challenges that we've had as a managed IT provider is just the supply chain impact to laptops, for example.
Yep.
Based on the challenges getting chips and those kind of things, right? But long lead times. But this is true of a lot of different things, and we're going to talk about supply chain specifically in a little bit. But this graphic I got from you as well, and I like this because it talks about unknown risks, right? How do you protect yourself from things you don't even know about? And just, do you want to comment some, Linda, on this, on the, not just the graphic, but just protecting yourself from unknown risks?
Well, I like the idea of the concept of layering, right? So it's not like a single defense. So you do this and you're protected. It really is a layering concept, so that if a risk gets through one layer, it might not get through another layer, and so on and so forth. So by the time if you've got a really strong risk management program, that you should in fact be one of the few organizations out there, because you've done such a good job, that you're actually not facing the risks that many others are, right? Because you've anticipated and you put these layers of defense in place. And that really is back to sort of the thinking about what and why we're doing. And then you can work on the how. A lot of people jump right into the how and they followed the leader. But this is really what it's all about, is strengthening your defenses.
Yep. And I like the understanding why, because I just think that's so important, to responding versus reacting, right? Being proactive versus reactive, if you will. Yeah. But I think it's a critical component of it. So we're gonna end up here, right? So this is a very hot topic. I think just evaluating the supply chain risks, and just as a former chief procurement officer, I mean, there are a lot of things, and certainly a lot of changes that you've seen over the past few years. But what I found interesting about this, and again, this came from McKinsey & Company, but there was if you look at supply chain risk in general, planning and supplier network is where I'll say the majority in this study, right? And again, this is a hypothetical illustrative company, but the planning and supplier network is where we're seeing a lot of challenges in people that have not even thought about these things, right? So, and I guess I sum it up, and I'll say this and then just get your comments on it. But in conversations with chief procurement officers in the past, right, it wasn't easy, but it was less complex than it is today, right? And I think the concept or the premise was reduce the surface area, right, of risk. And a lot of times what that really meant was reduce the number of vendors, right? Because if the vendors are introducing risk, then if you only have 1 versus 6, for example, then you would have less risk. But I think what was found is that there was also economic benefit because you get volume-based pricing and those kind of things. So there was a lot of effort put in from a procurement side and supply chain side to reducing the number of vendors that a company did business with. And today people are scratching their heads saying, hey, we only had 1 vendor and now I can't get parts, right? Or I can't get this, or I can't get that. And so that resiliency aspect from the supply chain is creating a lot of challenges. So where reducing number of vendors used to equate to reducing risk, it could actually today be adding risk, right? And so it's a very complex thing to figure out. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I read a really good article in Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago, published by Deloitte. So I must admit, when it comes to the actual movement of goods and services and parts, as a chief procurement officer in a services company, I have to admit, I didn't put a lot of time into this because in large services companies, you're not dealing with a lot of durable goods, right? You're dealing with them periodically. You need new furniture, you need new equipment, or you're going to build a new premises, right? So that did not loom large in what I learned. So what I have been trying to climb the learning curve pretty quickly here is a supply chain in the traditional sense is about actually source of supply. And typically the big issue, of course, is durable goods, whether that's parts or raw material or component pieces or finished goods. And the second thing is logistics, right? So think about just-in-time warehousing. That's kind of working against us these days. So what some of the mitigation strategies are, of course, are going back to the well and starting with your supply strategies to make a determination, really, where are the bottlenecks in it, what's going on, right? So you need to have good intelligence. It may not be that you need to disaggregate and to add new suppliers, because there's also benefits in being an important customer, right? You're kind of top of the list. So you really need to look at your critical input materials and the logistics it takes to get them to wherever you need them. And I would suggest you look at them by category, right? So how important are they to your organization, and what are your alternatives? And start to look very, very, very deliberately again about supply strategies and also the logistics. I mean, shipping prices have gone up in some cases like 100 times over. The cost of input material the other day about tariffs, right? So that's a thing to consider as well. So supply chain itself is really about, it really is an operational risk, and it has never traditionally been a control environment look, but it's part of the equation of being resilient. So there's good technologies out there as well. You can trace your goods and materials, right? So blockchain or RFID devices, et cetera. You can keep a very close eye on shipping and alternatives. And basically what you don't want to have happen is you finally get it shipped and then turns out there's nobody in that harbor to unload the ship, right? So even looking at shipping routes, so being very, very considerate in terms of the depth and breadth that you're going to go into to do supply chain analysis and determine whether or not a change is appropriate or not is certainly another area where we could spend a ton of time.
Yep, indeed. And I started chuckling a little bit because I was going to say, and then you put it on a boat that's got to go through the Suez Canal and it's blocked, right? So, I mean, how would you even anticipate an issue with that coming up? But, from a risk standpoint, I think it would be important to have the conversation, what if we can't get this material, right? For whatever reason, it's not, like a ship is blocking the Suez Canal. It's what if we just can't get it? And I think it's worth thinking about it in those terms. So that I think today we're seeing a lot of emphasis on supply chain, and from a third-party risk standpoint, my sense is, and what I'm getting from feedback from the market a lot of times is taking a harder look at the supply chain and making sure that resiliency is in place. So I thought we would spend a little bit of time talking about some best practices as it relates to strengthening the supply chain and the resiliency of the supply chain. But certainly that's one of the items is just really having those conversations, right? To understand. I think the answer, what I heard you say, Linda, was it depends, right? So, which is inevitably the answer for everything. You got an MBA to learn how to say that, right? That's
yeah. Yep. Cost me a lot of money, took a lot of time, but there you go.
There you go. So, and this is specific to manufacturing, but I thought it was viable to really just talk about some different strategies for gaining resilience in the supply chain. Are there any thoughts that you have to share with the audience that you think are valuable? And I think our audience is really made up of multiple industries as well. So.
Okay, so what we're seeing through the pandemic also is returning certain relationships to the domestic U.S., right? So there may be a good reason why you want goods or services actually produced or delivered from the same country, and that has a lot to do with rolling lockdowns and the uncertainty. In some cases, companies were able to repatriate certain activities, so it may be a consideration. Sometimes they left a third party or asked somebody to leave a fourth party, and they're able to move those relationships to an existing third party who is deemed to be more stable. So this is really supply chain perspective specific, but in terms of overall relationships, there are options, and some of them have been quite successful. I mean, gosh, the economy is roaring, so it can't be that bad, right?
So they say, right? But
So they say. Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned tariffs before, and who would have thought? I mean, just the political battles that are going on globally and the tariffs that are being, put on various different goods and services. Clearly, regionalization I think is a strategy for supply chains because of, and the pandemic probably was a catalyst and certainly exacerbated that, right? And opened a lot of people's eyes. But the move to, manufacturing goods overseas was economic driven, right? And then, and then if you can't get goods and services, then there's more economic impact than the benefit to manufacturing there, right? Which is why I think regional.
And you can probably tell from my accent that I'm speaking from Canada. So I'm watching some of the tariff wars. I mean, it makes you scratch your head, Steve. We were talking the other day about softwood lumber, right? So Canada is a big source of supply. There is certainly a lot more demand than supply. If you've gone to the hardware store lately or the Home Depot or whatever, I mean, price of lumber is out like 4 times what it was pre-pandemic. And yet they've introduced more tariffs for Canadian lumber passing into the US. So some of it has to just be opportunistic tax grab, but that doesn't help you, right?
That's right.
You still have to find the supply and you still have to pay.
Right.
So yeah.
And it certainly doesn't help the building community, right? There are a lot of people who would love to have materials right now. So yep, very, very valid. So we'll keep moving. So how do you determine which third and fourth party relationships really matter?
So I'm a big fan of the tiering system for the criticality, right? So to me, that's the first filter. How important is this? Some of them are, gosh, they fail. We fail immediately, right? If they stop working, we would immediately fail or cease operations, all the way down to it doesn't require risk treatment. So the firms that I work with, they either go with 3 or 4 tiers of relationships in scope for risk treatment. If they go with 3, that means that their tier 1s are a little bit bigger than if you go with 4. I'm more of a fan for 4 because that top layer can be that handful of relationships that really can, I mean, you would not be able to function at all as a company without them. And that's sort of like a superset of the top tier in a 3. So that's your first filter. And the second one is exposure to risk. There are certain types of risks you just have to manage, right? That's just a fact of life, either because of compliance, reputation, etc. And that can help you parse down have in scope for risk treatment and risk management.
Mhm.
So now the fourth party is a really good question, right? Because like I see a lot of people, they say, well, they send out some sort of due diligence that says, tell me about all your fourth parties. Well, you know what? You don't really want to know that. What you really want to know is who are the material fourth parties that you rely on in order to deliver goods and services to us, right? That's so the way that I would tackle that is, lawyers are really great with words. So go and ask them what the word material means, and then write it down, because you're only looking for the material fourth parties, and that can really help. So if you have a legal definition benefit, you can put it in your contract, right? Because that's what you're looking for when you want to have notifications. And when you're doing due diligence, you're pretty clear about what you're looking for. If you don't do that and you just ask who are your fourth parties, heaven knows what you're going to have.
Yep. Here's a
Yeah.
question for you, Linda. First of all, can you define a fourth party? What is the fourth party?
Oh, good question. So a fourth party is simply a critical third party to your third party,
Right.
right? So they're one step removed from you, and that makes them your fourth, but it's their third.
Right. So it's your third party's vendor or relationship.
Critical.
Right on, a critical vendor.
And sometimes they call them subcontractors, which I don't like that term either.
Yeah.
It's too.
Right. Right. So here's the question I have for you. To evaluate your fourth party's risk, you don't have a contract with that company. You have a contract with your third party, right?
Right.
They have a contract with them. So you have no legal basis for evaluating their risk. So how is that accomplished? I mean, how do you do this? How do you evaluate risk for fourth parties?
Well, the short answer is you don't. So in most cases, you can contract with them. So what you're going to really have to focus on is whether or not the third party that you're doing business with and you're relying on so greatly has a process in place that resembles yours, right? Can they identify their critical third parties? Do they segregate them, right? Have a segregation strategy that helps you understand the criticality and the exposure to risk? Do they have a decent due diligence and evaluation process? And do they contract and manage and monitor, right? The kinds of things that we're talking about companies should do. Your critical third parties should do the same thing.
Yep.
Now, let's be serious. Most of them are not there yet.
Right.
Yeah. So how do you deal with it? I would suggest, risk is not a competitive advantage, right? Like just go share with them whatever you need them to do. Help them with tools. Let them use your process for a while. Like, why would you not give away things that are important to you?
Right. Well, and especially if you want to require them to do certain things. But I think fundamentally you hit on something, Linda, that I subscribe to from it's a fundamental belief, basically. Like focus on the things that you can control and less on the things that you can't control, right? So
Yep.
Instead of trying to influence
Isn't that a proverb?
From your fourth party, right? Make sure your third party has a program in place, right? And to your point, I think this is great advice. Help your third party, right? If you have processes, especially, help them leverage your processes so they can properly evaluate the risk of their third parties. Certainly contractually.
And you don't have to tell them how you scored.
Right. You can influence some of this contractually by, not allowing them to share your data or, those types of things. You can manage your risk indirectly that way. So I think that's the secret to fourth party risk. Focus on your third party risk.
Now there are some companies. Yeah, and there are some kinds, in some rare instances, you can perform due diligence on the with cooperation by your third and fourth parties. And this is particularly helpful when you have really small companies. I did a whole assessment for like a really small company, and they just decided to include some of their some of their relationships in the scope of the assessment so that I could help them build the whole thing out. Rather than, because they were so heavily outsourced, it didn't make any sense to do anything different than that, right? Rather than looking at their control environment, we really looked at the larger infrastructure, the whole extended enterprise and their key relationships so that I could help them work with them better and more effectively because it was in everybody's best interest. But and then also if you're a behemoth company, you might get away with doing fourth party assessments.
As a requirement for doing business with the third party, right? I wanted to touch on this because, concentration risk, and you and I have had this conversation several times, and it's a focus area for a lot of different reasons. But what are your thoughts on concentration risk, and maybe just start with defining what it is and why it's so important?
Yeah, so concentration risk is a nice way to say, it's a fancy way to say putting all your eggs in one basket, right? That's all that it is. And so the question is basically, why is your C-suite and board interested is because they want to know whose basket their eggs are in, right? And you need to be able to tell them. And that means that if you've got a high concentration of relationships or geographies or whatever, that this is a view of the world that they're trying to understand. So some people think you can assess concentration risk as like a sort of like a control environment. But the truth is you have to have good data in order to be able to recognize concentrations, right? So if you don't know who your third and fourth parties are and where they are, you're never going to know what your concentration risk is. So it starts with good data, and then it's just another view of the world. Because what I have learned, I wrote a white paper with a group of executives just recently on third party concentration risk. And not too many of them have key risk indicators and thresholds associated with them. And that's simply because you just need to know. And then if there's a high concentration, there are certain actions you could take, but you're probably, in many cases, not going to do anything differently. You might not put more services in that place or with that company, but on the other hand, you may just want to be aware. So putting KRIs around it doesn't necessarily work, except for geographic concentration risk.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The thing I think is most interesting about concentration risk, it's not a new term. It's been around in the financial services space for quite some time, right? As it relates to generally credit risk or lending, I should say lending risk, right? Primarily as it has to do with real estate. But today it applies to everything when you're talking about supply chain resiliency, right? That's putting all your eggs in one basket. But what's interesting about concentration risk is it can be, you can have multiple vendors in your supply chain, but if they're all from the same region, for example, right? What if you can't do business or get a shipment from that region, right? So I think it can be misleading, to your point, if you look at controls and you do evaluation of each third party independently, and everything can come back positive, right? They don't have to have challenges individually, but as a whole, as a group, as a concentration, there could be some challenges if certain events happen or incidents happen.
Can I just pick up on a point that you made that I really, really like? So this whole notion of portfolios is actually, I think, to treat third party, right? Third party relationships, third party risks is portfolios. And that's what they do in credit risk, right? So when you think about real estate, for example, is a portfolio of risks it's a high risk portfolio. So you don't want too much of it on your books, right? But there's all kinds of portfolios of relationships that you could look at for third parties. You can look at it by the type of activity, the geography they're in, the businesses that they support, right? So there's the types of, risk exposure against sort of a single threat of risk, or, what is your cyber risk exposure? So when you start to think about your data as kind of more relational, right? So you can relate one to the other, and then start looking at it as a series of portfolios of really actionable data, then you'll know where to spend your time.
Agreed. Yep, agreed. And I just want to be respectful for everybody's time, so I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. We have more material I just, a lot of it's very, very good material, but I want to get to this part of it while we still have some time, and some great promotions as part of this webinar and for the attendees on this webinar. And I wanted to spend some time just mentioning these, but Linda, as the CEO of the Third Party Risk Institute, this is phenomenal, and I just am very appreciative to be able to participate in this. But I want all the members and all the attendees to know that membership in the Third Party Risk Institute has a fee, and for attendees of this webinar, ASMGi will cover that fee. So that you can become a member of the Third Party Risk Institute. Now, what does that actually mean? And I'm going to just turn this over to Linda, to you to elaborate a little bit on. But the roundtable discussions that are coming up very soon, like the end of this month, I believe, when they'll kick off. But maybe you can talk a little bit about, just those activities and what types of things you have intended for that.
Sure. Third Party Risk Institute is about peer networking. It's about training and education, right? So that really is the sole purpose of the organization. So the roundtables basically it's a relatively young company, so we're just kicking those off this month. But I have members from a lot of different countries, and there's really not a good place to go and have these conversations in a fairly open way. So that will be a regular occurrence, 10 a year. And then also I have workshops, right? Hands-on workshops, because people are tired of watching videos. So with all kinds of tools and templates, right, that can be downloaded and you can use them. And last but not least is the certification program. So if you would like to be a certified third-party risk management professional as a member, there's a discount. So the member benefits are the roundtable discussions, peer networking, and some really healthy discounts on the workshops and the certification program.
Yep, excellent.
And access to experts, right? Access to experts like yourself, Steve.
That's and you obviously. So it's a very great offer, and I encourage everybody to take advantage of that. So, and if you're interested, please drop us an email, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. The other thing that we're going to do, Linda mentioned earlier that she's written a second edition of her book, and I'm certain this is due to the pandemic. It's taken a little longer than expected to get it released to the public, but it's going to be released very soon. Yeah. And if you're interested in a book, the other thing ASMGi will do is provide a book to any attendee of this webinar that chooses to have that copy. So it's a great read, and it's certainly, I read the first edition. This is the second edition. I know there's some new material in here, but Linda, do you want to elaborate on that? Book?
So basically it's available in print and is an e-copy. It should be out anytime. I mean, gosh, it's been so delayed because of the pandemic, but it's the what and why. So every chapter is pretty much set up the same. Like, where did all this come from, right? So I cover about a dozen risk domains, and also how does this hook into enterprise risk management, operational risk management, and the tools that they use, so that it can come together as a cohesive view of risk. And then in every chapter, I have some tips based on what I've learned as things you should be aware of. Right. So, for example, it's awfully hard for cyber people to want to call it whether it's safe or not. And so what's the carrot and the stick, right? Just practical tips. Yep. So anyhow, so thank you very much. That's very generous of you.
That's awesome. And I am very excited about it. I do this all the time. I'm an avid reader. And so like I said, I read the first edition. I'm very excited to read the second edition as well, and get that into as many hands as possible. So
thank you. And
then lastly, I just want to mention, coming up from ASMGi, we're together with one of our other partners, Arctic Wolf. We're doing a summer SecOps roundtable also, and Guy Fieri, who many of you know from the Food Network, will be present and will be addressing the specialization of being a chef, quite honestly, right? So that said, if you're interested in that as well, please just reach out to us, and we'll get you registered for that also. And with that, I think we're over on time. So I do want to say thank you, and just thank you so much, Linda, for all of your wisdom and insights. And thank you for the attendees for sharing your time with us today.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.